Welcome to our newest exhibition in collaboration with George Petru, each time telling a new and bigger and better show. I'm Ross Coulthart. I'm a journalist and author, and I've worked with George Petru, who's the artist who has done these great portraits on a previous exhibition that I think some of you attended about the lost diggers, which were the photographs of World War I diggers we retrieved from a French farmhouse. And it's one of the joys of working with Findex that you have two brothers that run the company who have a passion for Australian history. This is our third exhibition series in collaboration with George Petru, each time telling a new story. The past shows that we've done with George have focused on great men and women who've served in our military. But today he shares 12 new stories of Australians whose names you may have heard, but stories that you may not know the full story about. These 12 individuals are all from varying walks of life and all eras. George will share with you why he chose these 12 people. Tonight we've got two special guests, George Petru and Kim Apostolides. George and Kim will be highlighting one of Australia's greatest untold stories, one of my favourite untold stories, the extraordinary Sir Hubert Wilkins. But before we get to that, I'd like to introduce Spiro Paul, who's the Managing Director and Chief Executive of Findex. Ladies and gentlemen, let's hear a few words from Spiro Paul.
Thank you, Ross. Ross is one of my favourite journalists, and there aren't many that I like in the market. But I've got to say that Ross has got an unblemished record for integrity in journalism. I'm sure you would all agree, and he's got very passionate about his craft and certainly has done fabulous work. I think it's also quite funny in a way that you've got three Greeks appearing on stage tonight talking about Australian history, but I can't help it. I love history all up, and certainly the history of our country, although it's only a couple of 100 years, is an interesting one. And you know, history is really just recording everyday living done by people like you and I, and occasionally you get, like the people in this room, some exceptional sort of lives, and that's what we're here to celebrate tonight. So your story is our business. The theme tonight is about famous Australian stories. It's the third exhibition that we've been privileged to share with George Petru, the artist, tonight. And the first one was obviously Ross's sort of initiated that by finding all those images in the attic in France, and out of that inspired George into a whole new genre of painting where he painted these fabulous portraits taken from those glass images, and I just still remember the eyes on those people and the despair in many of them in going through that horror of the First World War. And then he backed up with a series on Victoria Cross winners to celebrate our famous Australians who gave everything so that we can live the life that we do, and the Cross of Valour winners who in today's age, you know, they put themselves in harm's way to do great deeds for their fellow citizens. So that was fabulously well received, and now he's backing up with this exhibition, which is a number of famous stories. And you know, we all have a story, all of us. These people come from mainly, you know, unremarkable places, largely regional. For those of you that celebrate Christmas, may you have a fabulous Christmas with all of your loved ones, and may 2020 be a stunning year for each and every one of you and everyone that you love. Thank you.
Thank you, Spiro. Integrity, honour, character, courage. They're kind of old-fashioned words, aren't they, really? I've got a theory, and I want you to think about this as we go through tonight's discussion. I think we have a hang-up in Australia about revering and honouring our heroes. We've got a character that goes back to colonial days that tries to pull down the people who stick their heads up above the parapet, the people who do better than everybody else. And in this room tonight, you see tributes to some extraordinary people. I'm looking, for example, at the portrait of Weary Dunlop. I had the privilege of meeting Weary Dunlop back in the late 80s, and there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that I was in the presence of greatness. He was the most extraordinary, humble, but oozing character chap. It was an honour to have met him. And one of the people you're going to hear about tonight is Hubert Wilkins, Sir Hubert Wilkins. The person who's going to tell you about him is Kim Apostolides. Shortly you'll be hearing from Kim, but I'll just explain how Kim came to be involved in being an expert on Sir Hubert Wilkins. He made a tree change from central CBD Adelaide to a remote community called Mount Brian and ended up taking over the local pub, the Mount Brian Hotel, which is pretty much the only building in town. And he had a lifelong passion for South Australian history and genealogy, but he was interested in the story of Henry Brian, who was the guy who was lost in the 1839 Gawler expedition, which opened up a large part of South Australia. And almost by chance, he found out about this fella called Sir Hubert Wilkins, who'd grown up in Mount Brian. And Kim became the Treasurer Secretary of the Sir Hubert Wilkins Memorial Cottage Committee. He was quite literally, when he bought the pub, he was given an old key and told that people would occasionally stop and ask to go and have a look at the Wilkins house. And as he'll tell you, the absurdity was a lot of the people who were looking at this place were people coming from overseas who knew the story of this great Australian, a story which was largely lost to most Australians. And he's very successfully fundraised and got grants to cover the yearly running costs of the cottage, and he's turned it into quite a beautiful museum. He's got a collection of Wilkins ephemera there that he uses to entertain and educate tourists and academics. So now retired, Kim's full-time studying heritage tourism with a plan to package the Wilkins and Mount Brian East experience. So if you're going to South Australia, spare a thought for Mount Brian and the Sir Hubert Wilkins cottage. And we're also bringing George Petru up as well.
Thank you, Ross. What a great audience we have here tonight. Thank you for attending. My name's George Petru. My background is graphic design. I've been running a graphic design business for 40 years, and about 9 years ago I was diagnosed with cancer. So I thought perhaps it was time to make a bit of a change, slow down from work and see what happens. So having survived the cancer, taking a year off work and just recuperating, I thought this was a good opportunity to take up painting. I was doing a bit of painting prior to that. I was doing a bit of abstract painting. To me, it was a little bit sort of soulless, and I thought, I need a little bit more than this. So I thought one of my great loves is Australian history. I sort of tend to read a little bit, and I love reading wonderful stories about great Australians, great people in general, but especially Australians. So I thought, what a good idea. Perhaps we could do some portraits and perhaps involve some storytelling and perhaps involve some of their story in the painting rather than just doing a traditional portrait. This opened up different, I guess people from different walks of life, and opened up my colour palette too, because I was using similar colours. Like there's 2 World War I paintings over there, and the colours are all pretty much the same. So it was nice to sort of mix up and perhaps use a bit of colour, like over here with Mr. Monash. So it was a good change for me. The other reason for these 12 portraits, I just feel as though these people's status needs to be elevated. I don't think we not respect them. I don't think we understand them, and I think they need greater recognition. Nancy Wake. Now, Ross, I think you need to tell us a story about. Come on, you have to tell us because.
Look, I don't want to steal your thunder.
No, you're not stealing my thunder. Please do.
I did an interview with Nancy Wake once, and she was, she must have been in her 80s, and she was living in a pub in London at the courtesy of the British government because she'd run out of money. And it shocked me that this beautiful, incredibly heroic woman was basically living on the bones of her ass, basically, in this London pub. And she ran up a huge bar bill every day. and she was. It was all being paid for by the Foreign Office. But the great thing was she was a terrible flirt. This 88-year-old woman put her hand on my knee and flirted outrageously, and she told some great stories, including how to murder Nazis. She still knew how to do the chop that you did, and she described to me how she'd killed a Nazi soldier to defend herself with one blow, which was what the SOE taught them back then. She was one incredible woman, and largely unacknowledged.
Absolutely. Thank you. I thought it was a wonderful story that had to be told. She was our most decorated Australian, and she was known as the White Mouse because the Gestapo tried to capture her many times and failed every time. If you look, you'll see a little white mouse in that painting. It's not that hard to find. There is one there. And I guess I just wanted to highlight her awards by using that in colour, just having her in black and white. But a great Australian. General Monash, one of my heroes. I've painted General Monash 3 times, but this is a little bit different, not in a military capacity. Obviously, it's on the $100 note. I thought I would just sort of mix up the colours a bit and incorporate the colours of our currency, the $5, the $10, the 20, the 50 and the 100. So I'm trying to get that one up as a $185 bill. Not sure whether that'll happen. I don't think it will, but a great Australian, and certainly not valued. Would you say, Ross? He was one of our greatest, and I think he deserves a lot more recognition, I'm sure.
Completely under-acknowledged, really.
Yeah.
The greatest, who's acknowledged on the battlefield as the greatest general of the First World War.
Yeah, definitely, most definitely. This is a relatively unknown story. I won't go into too much detail, but young Henri, the little boy there, was a little French orphan during the First World War. He'd lost his parents and his sister in the early stages of the war. He just became an orphan, was just roaming around, and he stumbled across some Australians, an Air Force battalion, and they adopted him, and he became their mascot. They had a uniform made up for him. He just became one of the gang. And 2 brothers, that's Tim and Edward Tavell, decided they would adopt him. So the only way they could do that was they had to smuggle him into the country. So they arranged to put him in a sack and just carry him on board. If you look at the portrait over there, you'll see there's two A3s, and there's photos of Henri standing outside the sack, Henri in the sack, and Henri in the sack with Tim taking him on board. So it's a wonderful story. He ended up living in Melbourne. He's buried at the Faulkner Cemetery. But he did, given all the trials and tribulations that he went through, he died quite tragically. He was on his motorbike just down the road here in opposite Parliament House in Spring Street. And he was on a motorbike, it's at a U-turn, and a taxi came along, collected him, and died. It's hard to believe that someone who'd survived so much would die that way. It's very sad, quite tragic. Now, before I go, I have a question for the audience. I was wondering whether someone in the audience would be able to connect these names. There is a common thread, and I was wondering whether someone could sort of find out what that may be. But what I have for Jenny is a $185 note. This is only the 6th one being issued at the moment. So
I'm so privileged. Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. We'll have a photo later. Thank you. I was hoping that you didn't know the answer to that because I just wanted to give you one of my clues, which I thought was really clever. And the clue was going to be, they may be from the past, but there is a certain currency about them. I just need to say thank you to Findex. This is, I think, our 7th show as part of the Great Australian Stories. We started off in Cairns, we went down to Townsville, went into Dubbo, went into Sydney, had a couple of shows in Sydney. We were in Albury last week. We're here today, obviously, and next week we're in Adelaide. Then we have a bit of a break, and then we start going along New South Wales and Queensland again. Yeah.
So now let's hear about one of these Australian heroes, Sir Hubert Wilkins. I only knew a little bit about Hubert Wilkins because I wrote a biography of Charles Bean, who was our official First World War historian, and he described in awe this gentleman, soldier, cameraman who was shooting on the back of a tank, gets blown off by a German shell while he's filming, grabs the camera, picks it up, puts it back on the tank again and keeps on filming. He was, as Kim will probably tell you, almost bulletproof. The most extraordinary fellow, Sir Hubert Wilkins, and here to tell you about him, Kim Apostolides.
Thank you, Ross. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank George for making that phone call and giving me the 39 minutes that I needed to explain this much about Sir Hubert Wilkins. And also, I have to say, the Windex family have embraced me, and I don't think I've actually felt part of a family so quickly. So I would like to thank Findex, and I mean the entire family. This building is actually called the Midnight Oil House. Some people may recognise it. It was on the cover of their Diesel to Dust album, and it's actually the most photographed building in South Australia and is actually famous around the world. Ken Doan actually made it famous by taking that photograph. It's actually 8 kilometres from where I live, and it's halfway to the Wilkins cottage. I will refer back to the building shortly because I'm going to talk a little bit about Sir Sidney Kidman. There's a lot of sirs I'm going to talk about, so I'll be just referring to them as Kidman, etc. Otherwise, I end up lisping, trying to get the sirs and Sydney out at the same time. It just freaks me out.
The American Antarctic ship USS Arnhem arrives in Sydney with 280 sailors and the cargo of 12 penguins. The sailors say they're glad to be in Sydney to thaw out after the polar freeze, but the penguins don't seem too sure about it all. Also on board is famous Australian polar explorer Sir Hubert Wilkins, paying his first visit home after 17 years. And there are some...
One of the greatest explorers of the 20th century was born on the 31st of October 1888 at a small homestead 100 miles north of Adelaide. As a young man, he embraced the new technology of cinematography before setting off to explore the world. He worked with Scott, Shackleton and Amundsen during the heroic age of exploration. In World War I, he filmed at the front lines and was described as Australia's equivalent to Lawrence of Arabia. In the 1920s, he was the first to fly an aeroplane over the Arctic Sea, the first to fly in the Antarctic, and among the first to fly around the world. He revolutionised Arctic travel with a submarine expedition to the North Pole in 1931. He continued to explore in the 1930s and 40s and became a top-level advisor of polar travel in the 1950s. After his death in 1958, his family kept secret the films, photographs, writings and memorabilia of eccentric Australian explorer Sir Hubert Wilkins. Now they have been discovered, and his amazing life can be explored for the first time.
I'm going to talk a little bit about some people that thinly veil back to Sir Hubert Wilkins. In the conversation with George, he described the artwork that we're looking at, and these names that he was dropping into my ear were names that I've actually read about in conjunction with Sir Hubert Wilkins. Now, Sir Sidney Kidman lived in this dugout with a young boy called Willie, an Aboriginal boy that he'd got quite used to, and actually taught this young man how to actually find water and how to actually care for stock, etc. Now, Kidman actually worked for both the Wilkins family and the Thomas family locally in Mount Bryant East, and actually was paid £35 a year to actually cart wood and also refresh horses to the hut that I showed you before. The Midnight Oil House was actually a Cobb & Co station. So what the Thomas family had to do was actually give them fresh horses each day. So it was one of the jobs that Kidman had to do, was take them to this particular house, the Midnight Oil House. And what he did while he was there, he actually did a bit of research and found out how much the government paid Cobb & Co to deliver a letter. So Kidman actually was quite took his 5 shillings and actually went off and went to the Thomas family and traded his one-eyed horse for 2 white horses. This painting is actually part of the Mount Bryant Hotel when I took it on, and it's a depiction of Kidman with the 2 white horses that he started his business with. Now, what he did was took those 2 white horses from the Cobb & Co and actually undercut the Cobb & Co by 1 penny per letter, and actually very quickly took over the delivery of the mail in Australia. From that, he bought his first cow, his millionth cow, and half of Australia, etc. So Kidman actually passed on a bit of a legacy, because a young boy called Willie actually became King Willoughby in Sir Hubert Wilkins' time, was actually leader of the Nudgee country that I live on. I'm going to talk a little bit about Monash now. All these people relate back to Wilkins quite well. Monash was actually the greatest general we had in our First World War. The difference between Monash and every other leader of the time was he included his officers and his men in all decisions and actually briefed people what was going to happen that day, and at the end of each day got the same men back in and reported what happened, what they were going to do, what they were going to achieve, whether it happened or not. Now, Wilkins had just come back from 4 years on the Arctic ice with a guy called Wilhelm Stephenson. He was completely the opposite. He was a very autocratic leader and told no one anything. And Wilkins actually had to struggle to keep the men on that expedition in favour of Stephenson. So he spent a lot of work sort of trying to work out how do you placate people with someone who's an authoritarian. Monash was completely the opposite. What he did is gave Wilkins the ability of 15 minutes break, 15 minutes to get over the foxhole, out onto no man's land, get his camera set up, etc., before they actually started any sort of armament attack, etc. The Germans actually held this in great respect, as Wilkins in great respect as well, and did the same thing. Wilkins was actually injured multiple times, but indirectly injured. He was never actually targeted to be injured, and he actually managed to actually film any moving footage you've ever seen of World War I where people are coming out of foxholes or they're actually taken from on top of machinery like the army tank, etc., were actually filmed by Wilkins, not Hurley. Hurley gets the recognition, but Wilkins took 90% of the 100% of the moving images, but 90% of the stills. This is actually Monash being awarded his knighthood on the field, the first person ever to be knighted on the field. Wilkins took these two photographs, that's why I've included them. Monash actually stayed in Wilkins's life throughout his life and became a mentor to Wilkins in lots of ways, and I'll be dropping Monash in a couple more times. This is actually, we talked about currency before and someone mentioned a coin with someone on it. This is actually the prototype for a $1 coin celebrating Gallipoli, and Wilkins is actually the gentleman behind the camera, and I like the fact that George included that camera in the image that's up there in abstraction. Now, when the coin actually turned up, the person involved actually airbrushed Wilkins out and left the gaffer on there. So the coin had to be recalled. So if you actually see any $1 coins with that image on minus Wilkins, it's actually extremely collectible. They had to take it back. They wanted to honour him on our money, but someone made a mistake. These are actually the medals that they're not his medals, they're replicas, but these are the medals that Wilkins earned, and I'm going to come back to Monash. The one that's important is the one on the end, which is actually the Military Cross. Now, it has a bar, which means that Wilkins was awarded that Military Cross twice, but they don't give you another medal, they give you a bar. The first time Wilkins was awarded, he had rescued a platoon of American soldiers who their commissioned officers had actually been taken out pretty quickly, and they didn't really know what to do, and they were literally cowering inside a foxhole when Wilkins came across them, and Wilkins had to cross machine fire to get them, knowing that he had the ability to do that, and that the Germans were very respectful of Wilkins, and the reason for that is because had the Germans won the war, they would have wanted that film that Wilkins had actually shot. So Wilkins actually had quite a bit of respect. The other thing is he was awarded the bar for rescuing 19 New Zealanders in the same situation. He's also got an oak leaf up the top because it was mentioned twice, his bravery in Dispatches by Bean. This is my favourite lady in the world, and I wish we all knew a bit more about her. She's what I like to term my favourite bitch. She started off life as Suzanne Evans in Victoria in Walhalla, and actually got to be trained in the Conservatory of Music in Melbourne by the great Dame Nellie Melba, who's seen great potential in Suzanne and actually encouraged Suzanne to go to Italy to study under the impresario that had taught Nellie. And what this impresario had taught Nellie, because Nellie already knew how to sing, was two things. Ask for $1 more than this guy called Caruso, and make sure that your demands are extremely demanding, because to be number one and be a female in the opera world, you have to actually set yourself apart. So she was always paid $1 more than Caruso. And the second thing that she did was they had to invent Melba toast to cover up the taste of quail eggs and caviar. She insisted on every railway carriage and every backstage she was in that there was actually quail eggs and caviar, and she bought her own Melba toast. She didn't like either of them, but they were the most expensive things that you could ask for, and she needed that reputation. These days, it's, the Rolling Stones wanted all the jelly beans set out to different colours and stuff, but back in her day, people have to understand that this Kardashians that we know of were still around back then, and Wilkins was pretty good at it. Suzanne, if the ladies would notice, is in a very, what would you say, daywear with a feather boa on. She was actually doing here in New York City. She bypassed Italy, went to New York City because she decided against Nellie's best judgment. She wanted to be an actress and she wanted to go on the stage. She didn't want to actually sing all this old stuff. She wanted to sing ditties, etc., and have a really good old time. Wilkins and her met by Monash. Monash's nephew was actually married to Suzanne at one stage before Suzanne became Suzanne Bennett and moved to America. And she decided when she was in America that she would become a bit of a star, etc. So Monash was asked, when the ticker tape parade was organised in 1928, because Wilkins had actually got his knighthood and flown over the Arctic Sea, etc., they had to give a posy to him in a ticker tape parade. So they thought they'd get an expatriate, and Suzanne fitted the bill perfectly. So Monash arranged for Suzanne and Wilkins to meet, and within a very short time they had actually got married. But I'd like to refer to this photo a little bit because there's a story that Jeff Maynard, who's written quite a few books on Wilkins, likes to tell, and that is that Suzanne had sent a letter to him asking for £10 to go for this audition to buy a new costume. He sent her back a letter saying he'd just spent £157,000 on a periscope and a drill for the top of this submarine he was going to take under the polar ice. Apparently he received 6 bottles of hair restorer, no note. Suzanne did like to remind him often that he had no hair. But you'll probably notice that she does look pretty good though. This is going to tie me into somebody else, and that is actually Sir Kingford Smith. I've got to keep up with this, guys. This is actually an 8-page letter written to Sir Kingford Smith's mechanic. Why would Wilkins write a letter to Sir Kingford Smith? Because he actually had sold him 2 Fokkers that were turned into the Southern Cross. Everyone knows about the Southern Cross, and we all associate that with old Kingford Smith, but it was actually Wilkins's plane. It was actually 2 Fokkers that Wilkins had actually taken up to the Arctic, and he crashed both of them. In one of them, a newspaper reporter had actually gone into the blades and was actually chopped up, etc., because he'd actually walked around the front of the plane, didn't realise he'd be sucked into the blades. That's a bit of a gruesome story, but it actually happened. What Wilkins did with these 2 planes when he got them back to America, he sat and thought a while, because Wilkins was a bit of a thinker. You'll probably, if you ever read a biography, you realise he was a great thinker. And he sort of thought to himself, he had a 3-engine Fokker and a tri-motor Fokker. I thought that meant the same thing, but it doesn't mean the same thing. I don't know what it means, but it doesn't mean the same thing. So what he did was he took the wings off of the tri-motor and actually put it onto the 3-engine plane. The benefit of doing that was it changed aerodynamics forever. It actually changed the way the wing sat on the plane, and the other thing that he had actually done with this thing was actually they were wooden wings. Up until then they were actually canvas-covered, bits of metal, all sorts of things went on, but they were actually made out of wood. What Kingford Smith needed to do was buy a plane to do this Pacific crossing that the Australian government were going to give him £10,000 for. Wilkins needed to buy a more modern plane called a Vega to actually get the next part of polar flight done. And so he decided he would sell this plane called the Detroiter at that stage, not the Southern Cross, sold it to Kingford Smith for £3,000. He didn't really have the money, so he only gave him £1,500, and then Wilkins decided he would keep the motors, so all this guy got was actually the fuselage of the plane. So he needed $3,000 to actually put these engines back on the plane. So what does Wilkins do? He rings up his old friend Monash and says, is there any way you would be able to help us? Now Monash, if you're Victorian, so you probably realise he set up the weirs and dams and bridges and railway lines. So Monash was actually brought the Chaffee brothers over from America to actually do that. They were actually the builders and engineers that did it. And he sort of rang them up and said, do you know anyone in America that will be able to help Kingford Smith get £3,000? And the Chaffee brothers said, look, one of our brothers is still the manager of the California Bank. Why don't I ring him? So Monash actually organised then for Kingford Smith to get the £3,000, put the motors back on the plane, and the thing with that is that Sidney Meyer actually bought out that debt pretty quickly. So lots of people have this opinion that old Kingford Smith owned the Southern Cross. He flew it. He didn't actually ever really own it. Now the benefit of this plane was, and this letter was, Wilkins actually gave 8 pages to the mechanic so he understood exactly what modifications were done to the plane. One of the major modifications was with these wooden wings is he'd hollowed out one wooden wing on one side and put a water desalination plant in. On the other side, he'd actually filled it out and filled it up with nuts and chocolates, etc. Wilkins was a little bit obsessed with being a long time in a plane, 20 hours at a time, etc. So he actually had to research input and output of bodily functions. He realised putting in water would actually take the longest to come back out, and it could be desalinated and re-drunk. He learnt in his trip to film for Coco that chocolate nuts, as in fruit nut chocolate, takes a long time for the body to digest, so you don't have to go. And so what the plan was here was he'd actually even got the wheels, and the engine was actually attached by wooden blocks, etc. So had they had to ditch in the Pacific, they could have got out, sawed the wheels off, sawed the engine off, and the wings would have eventually really effectively been a raft. And that would have given them the ability then to be rescued. Thank heaven they didn't actually need that at all. So that eight-page letter really helped them a lot. This is just a picture of the two guys together with the engines on the plane. And it took me a long time to get the story where the engines had to actually be a very big part of it, and Wilkins had actually taken them back because they couldn't afford them. This brings me in a little way to Nancy Wake, who was actually a spy during World War II. Wilkins has always been put across, and if you read lots of books about him, he was into espionage and he was a spy. What he had the privilege of being was the son of the very first white boy born in the South Australian colony. His father, Harry, was born 9 days after the Emma arrived in Holdfast Bay in South Australia, and was actually a privileged person in Parliament, and actually had lots of things and lots of benefits on the farm. Netfield, the property I look after, is actually called Netfield because the South Australian government put a rabbit-proof fencing around it at their expense, so it was actually called Netfield because it was netted in. The Wilkins family were also given seed drills, combine harvesters. Any modern technology that was bought here was actually taken to the Wilkins property and actually test run, etc. So the Wilkins family were pretty well known, and what young George did when he was off to his England trip was he was given a letter of introduction by the Governor of South Australia. What that means, guys, it's a bit of an old-fashioned thing to talk about now, but every embassy around the world had to accept Wilkins in and had to assist him at all costs, etc. So Wilkins actually had a pretty privileged position. That gave him the ability to go into Russia, Germany, Japan, China, India, all the enemy countries of the time, plus all the allied countries Wilkins had access to. Now, what Wilkins had actually done in 1940, etc., was try and join the war, but he was unable to do it because of his age, so he went into development for the American government, etc. So he was actually spying, but not spying in a military sense. He was actually in a, what we say, industrial sense. What he'd done, he'd gone through Germany, looking at metal structures, etc., realising that the Germans had better metal than the English did, and our bombs, etc., had to have been of a higher firepower to actually penetrate tanks, etc. He'd actually gone to India to actually look at Gurkhas' turbans. I always share this. I've got a 14-year-old nephew who was searching these pictures out and showed me about 14 pictures of Gherkins before I got him to understand I was talking about Gurkhas. Now, the Gurkhas had a turban on, etc. And what Wilkins had done, he was a great observer of things, and being with Bean and with Monash at the end of the day, they were actually reading the reports of the amount of injuries. And what was happening to the Tommies was that they were getting lots of facial injuries, etc., from shrapnel coming back off the ground. The pie tin hat that was designed for World War I was designed for shrapnel raining down on you, but most of the actual shrapnel was coming up to their faces, so they had a lot of facial injuries. And what Wilkins had noted was the Gurkhas didn't suffer the same amount, so he thought this rounded thing rather than this would actually be of some benefit. So he'd gone over to India to do that. While he was there, he was also researching something we now call camouflage. These helmets were designed by Wilkins because they were actually a similar shape to a turban, etc., and camouflage. What Wilkins had done on this trip was he was taking soil samples and taking colour swatches of all the greenery of all the different countries. We're talking Sahara, Sub-Saharan, snowfields, etc. And on his way through there, he was also researching something called rayon. Girls probably know what rayon is. It's a waterproof fabric that you can wash it, hang it over the towel, and it would actually dry creaseless, etc. It also is waterproof. So Wilkins actually developed what is we now call a parka. So he needed something from his snow days where when they were wearing seal skins, at the end of the day, they'd have to take them off, scrape them, dry them, and then make sure they were dry before they put them on, because all the perspiration would actually ice up inside of the actual jacket they were wearing. So what Wilkins needed was something that wouldn't take perspiration in and wouldn't let water through. So we get what is called a modern day parka. This was the prototypes for the parka, and it was completely reversible because he was a very fashion conscious man with the fur trim, etc., etc. Now, I won't show that one just yet because I just want to talk a little bit more about what Wilkins did. He and Nancy Wake, like I said, were spies. Both worked for Hearst newspaper, so they were known to each other. One of the things that Wilkins had done, he'd gone to Japan and had toured the aircraft industry in Japan. And when he came back to America, he warned them that they actually had the ability to fly an aircraft from Japan to America and return. And there was an imminent danger of them actually having a bombardment. The Americans, there were 3 different people that warned the Americans of this Pearl Harbor, and the Americans chose not to take any notice of it. And as we know, the Japanese did have the ability to fly that far. Now, Wilkins was someone that was walking through a factory, he would talk to the guys on the ground and gather all this information. So whilst he was a spy, he was gathering intelligence for basically the war effort, etc. Wilkins was also filmed a lot. If you've ever watched one of the World War films, the actual horse and carriages trying to get across duckboards in World War I, and a lot of the men were actually starving and eating whatever they could find in the foxholes because the bully beef tins weighed so much and the horses and that couldn't actually feed their men. So Wilkins was a bit obsessed with famine, etc., and coming from a farming family, he had experienced quite a lot of hardship himself, thought to himself, if we've got too many oranges in the Riverland, we should be able to actually dehydrate them, send them over to California, rehydrate them, and then everyone would have oranges. So we went from bully beef tins in World War I to dehydrated food in World War II. And what Wilkins had actually designed was a 24-hour pack. So each soldier would be given his 24-hour ration. You could stretch it to 48 if you really needed to, but they were given a pack about that big of dehydrated food. So he believed if you were clothed properly, you were fed properly, you were armed properly, you would win the war. And as you know, the Allies have prevailed in all the wars that we have done. The Allies prevail. Wilkins died in 1958, but we are still using everything he did, and they are still using the colour swatches to make camouflage for each battle that comes along. We are still using Wilkins's, his expertise. The other thing I get asked a lot about, because I didn't want to do a biography, guys, and tell you he did this, if you did that. If you want it, there's 27 books over there. I can tell you which ones to read to get the whole story on Wilkins. But what Wilkins had actually done early on was realise he had to finance these things himself, because governments around the world were notorious for not actually offering you money but then not delivering it at the long run. So what did Wilkins do? He got a contract with Shell Oil. It didn't work out very well because Wilkins decided the oil needed to be thicker when he was in the Sahara, and it needed to be thinner when he was in the Arctic, and Shell would not allow him to actually play around with the viscosity of their product. So Wilkins got a contract with Mobil Oil, who didn't mind if he played around with their oils, because oils ain't oils, as you know. And Wilkins actually realised and they allowed Wilkins to make oil thicker for when he was in the tropics, because obviously they were getting covered in very liquid oil. When he's in thinner, and then when they're in Antarctica, it had to be a little bit thinner because otherwise they had to use kerosene fires underneath the engines, which were often caught alight, to actually get the plane started. So Wilkins thought he'd take this contract with Mobil Oil, and they paid him basically $10,000 a year just to make sure that he was ready for posters, etc. This is a good lark, he thought. So he smoked Camel cigarettes. So he became the face of Camel cigarettes for about 20, 30 years, and actually dedicated his lung capacity and his digestion to only smoking Camel cigarettes and only at least 1 or 2 packets a day. By the time he was in his 50s, he actually had gone on to a pipe, etc., but apparently he still liked Camel tobacco in there. The other thing he liked to have was Lord Calvert whiskey, a gentleman's drink, and it's a story that he writes in his very first book of his expedition through the top of Queensland, etc., is he'd taken X number of crates of methylated spirits, which disappeared pretty quickly, and he had to actually use his Lord Calvert whiskey for preserving things. And the British government were a bit disappointed because a lot of the bugs and that were in the Lord Lord Calvert whiskey didn't arrive in very good condition. So I don't know whether he was swigging out the bottle while he was doing it. But he also only ever used Leica cameras and Leica film, because they were free. And he was the first man ever to be given an electronic hearing aid by Leica, and apparently spent the 20 years he owned it patting it and telling people it didn't really work very well, and he kept pulling it apart and remaking it, etc. But Wilkins was actually like a Kardashian of now. Back in his day, he didn't do any talks for less than $50,000, but the $50,000 had to be paid to an expedition, not exactly to him, etc. So Wilkins's money came from that. Apparently, when he died, Suzanne spent about 4 or 5 hours taking the cheques and the money out of his hotel room. Like most people, country people where I live, a $50 note and a $100 note usually smells like the mattress. And apparently they picked up and she found close to £100,000 under his mattress, etc. So Suzanne did benefit. She did get good clothes. And from 1958 to 1978, when she died, she lived a pretty flash life, I can tell you. She took great delight in actually taking everything she could of Wilkins's and auctioning it off, because she didn't get that £10 for that costume. She got it back 1,000,000 times over.
Thank you so much for that, Kim. I'll bring George up and we'll have a quick Q&A. We haven't got a long time to talk, but we'll just do a couple of questions. Kim, the thing that really amazes me about what you say about Sir Hubert Wilkins is that he really is under-acknowledged in Australia, but he's taught about in schools in the United States, isn't he? He's actually famous over there.
He's actually part of the curriculum, and it amazes me because we actually have a book that's actually written in English pounds and American dollars to actually be taught in English and American schools. And one of the things I've been trying to get is actually into Australian schools. Look, it's a bit difficult because Wilkins did spend the large portion of his life living in America because it was close to the Arctic. The only reason he lived in America is he could actually drive to Alaska. He didn't have to fly. Or like in Antarctica, you have to catch a boat down there. But I don't know whether Australians really appreciate that cutting down tall poppies, how much that can affect their history, and then that affects, in turn, our history.
He was almost like an astronaut is today, isn't he? I mean, what he was achieving. Can you give us a little bit about what he was achieving in the Arctic and Antarctic expeditions?
Look, he'd spent most of his life trying to get the weather stations up and running. He believed that 12 weather stations positioned 6 at the top and 6 down the bottom would actually give us the ability to predict weather for about 5 or 10 years ahead. And what we do now, we have nearly 500 of these weather stations, but he spent his whole life. But the government that would actually give him money with the Americans, because the Americans could see the value in their wheat belt is in the middle of their country, a bit like ours is around South Australia, but they appreciated what he was trying to do, and that is stop people from starving to death from around the world.
Now, George, I know you've clearly got favourites amongst the 12 portraits that you've got here tonight. Which one's your favourite?
Look, I'd have to... Look, I only have 12 favourites, so... because I love all the stories, I really don't have a clear favourite. I do like young Henri's story, the little orphan boy, that's one of my favourites. And I do like the banjo portrait and this gentleman here too, because of who he is. But
I was amazed, though, look, to hear Kim talking about Sir Hubert Wilkins, and he's pulling in Kingsford Smith, he's pulling in John Monash. You know, you actually were able to make references to associations that he had with a number of the other people. And yet Australia was such a small country 100 years ago.
Look, the expatriate community around the world is really a group on their own. And Wilkins, like I said, this letter of introduction actually helped Wilkins. But then people like Monash, with one phone call, well, a phone call then would have taken 24 hours, but with that one phone call, Wilkins was actually able to call in the good numbers, really.
So, George, have we done these people a disservice? I mean, I appreciate, as you say, Dame Millie Melba is acknowledged. But is there an embarrassment in Australia about acknowledging our heroes, do you think?
it seems so. I mean, I guess it's the tall poppy syndrome, but I don't really know the answer. I don't know the answer to that. I think they do need, their status does need to be elevated, and I hope by having these little forums that people understand and perhaps read their story and show them greater respect.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think there's any doubt that both George and Kim have done that. I'd like to thank both of them very, very much.
Could I just say one thing before we do go? This is, as you know, our last exhibition was about the Victoria Cross, and the end result of that book, the author is actually here tonight, Michael Madden's over there, and I just wanted to say this was the end result of his 4 years of hard labour, and we tried to promote it during the Findex shows, and Findex were so generous in buying the first 100 copies of this. So in case you haven't seen the book, we'll put it over there with Hubert Wilkins' book. It's a fabulous book. We are in the process of putting together a documentary on this book. The producer director is over in the corner over there. He's shooting a bit of footage for it tonight. So we are looking for some financial support. If anyone's out there got some money, we'd love to talk to you. But just have a look. If you haven't seen the book, please have a look. It's a wonderful piece of journalism and storytelling again. So thank you for that, Ross.
No problem. Now listen, let's all go and have a drink, but don't be in a hurry to go because we have a lucky door lottery, which we will be drawing in about 20 minutes. And there's this fabulous prize. So stick around, have a drink, come and meet any of us and have a chat, and let's all talk about our great Australian heroes and heroines. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Ross Coulthart. I'm a journalist and author, and I'm here tonight at the third of the Findex exhibition series with George Petru. And tonight we're doing essentially unacknowledged Australian heroes and heroines.
Tell me about your particular background with George, and I suppose what his unique perspective on this subject matter and in the art world is.
One of the things I've loved ever since I was involved in the discovery of the Lost Diggers photographs, which were these glass plate photographic negatives that we found hidden in a French farmhouse 100 years after the First World War. One of the things I love is the way that the Australian public, members of the public, have just come up to me and got in touch and wanted to do something with them. And George had seen the TV series and read the books that I'd written, and he was really excited about it. And he was an artist living here in Melbourne, and he wanted to do portraits of the Lost Diggers pictures. And so I naturally said yes. We got the permission of Kerry Stokes, who's the person who has the rights to the Tullier collection. And it was a joy because George rendered these beautiful interpretations of the Lost Diggers images. He took the stories that I'd written based on the service files of these young men, and he turned them into quite emotional portraits that told the stories of these people in ways that the photograph didn't. One of my favourites is the lost digger we called the Sad Digger, who was a young man who was a signaller, and he died in tragic circumstances laying cables for one of the great battles of the First World War Western Front. And George's version of the Sad Digger is very, very moving, and I love the expression and the emotion that he puts into his portraits.
Can you articulate what George does with a particular story, with a particular image, and how he brings that to life? What does he do?
Well, it's kind of funny because I'm an author, so I'm generally writing between 4 in the morning and 8 in the morning. And the only person I know who's up at that mad hour is George Petru, because he gets up, like I do, very, very early in the morning and does his portraits. And we've spoken a couple of times very, very early in the morning. He's got the freedom that an artist has that a journalist doesn't have. I've got to stick to true facts and tell them accurately. He tells the truth, but what he does is he brings emotion and expression into his art in a way that I admire and envy, quite frankly.
Obviously, you've got an inside running on tonight's particular subject matter, but was there anything that was particularly poignant to you or that you've learned along the way that you maybe didn't before?
One of the things that frustrates me about Australia is we knock our heroes. We pull down our tall poppies. We have an embarrassment about acknowledging people who've done exceptional things. And it's quite unusual. I mean, America reveres its business people. It reveres its military heroes. It reveres the people who've discovered things or explored things. Australia doesn't in that way. And I think it's important to correct that, not to traduce history, but to commemorate it. The people in this room are now aware of a great Australian called Sir Hubert Wilkins, who, quite frankly, when I first read one of his biographies, I was blown away. The guy was just extraordinary. He achieved more in one lifetime than most people achieve in 10. And he was a hugely successful Australian who went on to do such incredible things that he's in the syllabus in American school books. But most Australians have no idea who he is. And it's the same with all of the portraits around this room. And it's what I love about what George does. I mean, Weary Dunlop some people in this room will know. They're of the generation that grew up knowing who Weary Dunlop was. But this was a great man, a doctor, who showed incredible dignity and courage in dealing with the cruelty of the Japanese Imperial Army during World War II in prisoner of war camps for Allied soldiers. Weary was the man who stood up to them. Nancy Wake, I mean, one of the greatest SOE British spies during World War II. She really did karate chop a German Nazi SS officer in the neck and kill him with one chop. By golly, she loved talking about it. And the thing is, I had the privilege of meeting Nancy, but by golly, George has captured her so well. And that's what I love about all of the images in the room. He's been able to read their stories, put a bit of their biography into the way he tells their story. Right down, for example, to the fact that he's got a little white mouse hidden inside the Nancy Wake portrait.
Tell me about the community impact of this particular art series, and tell me about the width and breadth of where this series is going, and I suppose why it's important to take it not just to the metropolitan centres of Australia, but right around the country.
I didn't go to Orange, for example, but I do have friends who live in Orange who went to the exhibition there, and they actually sought me out because they knew I was associated with it, and they said, "Oh, Ross, I just want to tell you what a magnificent thing it was to have this event in a small country town like Orange, which basically brought the story of so many great Australians to a very willing audience." They loved it. And it's interesting because I think there is a kind of a cringe in mainstream media that says it's not good to make much of military heroes, or it's not good to remember too much of past history, because quite frankly these millennials these days, all they're interested in is the Kardashians and what's on social media. Quite frankly, they do care when it's explained to them. And the great and the significant thing about this exhibition is very much like the Lost Diggers. When we did the Lost Diggers, Kerry Stokes paid for the exhibition of the Lost Diggers images to be sent right round Australia to little country towns all over the country. And the response that we got in those country towns, in those more remote communities, was far greater than in the mainstream big cities. People really appreciated it. And I think at times of drought, times of hardship in our farming communities, that's really important. And all credit to Findex for doing it, quite frankly.
Last question, I suppose, on that final point there. I suppose spent a career trying to find, I suppose, the truth in what people are trying to do in the community, back with everyone else. You had this breadth of experience with Findex and with George over a number of years. Explain, I suppose, how this is rooted in a genuine passion and interest for this sort of stuff.
But what I do love is that as a corporate institution, they've recognised the importance of honouring Australia's history and honouring the people who've made those moments in history. And I think they've done that in the face of public scepticism, and I think sometimes a kind of an embarrassment in Australia that we're putting people up on a pedestal. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think sometimes we do actually have, as we have with Sir Hubert Wilkins, who we've made the focus of tonight's event, we really do have Australians that have achieved incredible things, and they should be commemorated. They should be remembered.
Thank you very much for your time.
No problem.
My name's Michael Madden. I'm the author of the book The Victoria Cross Australia Remembers. We're at the Sofitel in Melbourne tonight for a Findex function looking at the George Petru paintings that he's done on 12 great Australians. My connection with George is fairly about 2 years old. I met George while I was working on my book. George was painting Victoria Cross recipients. I met him through a mutual friend, and the minute that I saw George's work, particularly the work he'd done on the Lost Diggers of Vignacourt, I was utterly blown away by his ability to capture the human soul, particularly within the eyes of the paintings. And everything that George does comes from a genuine and honest place. He's one of the most wonderful and philanthropic people that I've ever met, and I cannot recommend highly enough that getting hold of some of his work and having a look at it, because it is completely world class. And Findex's connection with George and the way they've supported him through the years is absolutely unbelievable. And these events which they do with him every year are very, very important, because this helps people understand through George's artworks and the storytelling of some really important Australians. The Victoria Cross recipients, the 12 incredible people he's painted for tonight, and I just hope he keeps on going because George himself deserves a place among these 12 people. He is an incredible Australian. Him and Findex both deserve a lot of thanks from everybody for what they've done.
If you were to articulate George's particular style, what makes him stand apart? What is it about what he does to bring these photos, these drawings, these ideas together into what we see tonight?
George has an ability to recreate almost photo quality reproductions, but he tends to steer away from that. He incorporates a little bit of that with a lot of abstract sort of signatures and flavours to his work. And he has a way of finding, even in the background of these characters, a way to tie the background behind them into the lifelike images of their faces, and particularly through the eyes and the images. It's something very unique. It's almost a landscape abstract quality that he brings to portrait painting. It's phenomenal and it's unique.
And why do you think it's so important to bring to light some of these told and untold stories of great Australians over the years?
It's extremely important. When somebody of George's calibre paints a person, an Australian, they're immortalised forever. And I've seen this repeatedly with the Victoria Cross recipients that he's painted, his involvement in my book. When he does that, people really pay attention and it gets them. The paintings draw them in, and George always supplies the background of these characters behind it, and it's a wonderful gateway to get people in. It's extremely important that he continues keeping on doing this.
Were there any particular stories of the 12th tonight, or anything from the presentation that maybe surprised you, or that you walked away from tonight not knowing?
I knew a fair bit about Wilkins because George told me about him. Before that, I didn't know much. I've learned even more tonight, but I've always been a big fan of Nancy Wake. Almost like a schoolboy crush. She was just an unbelievable person, and I honestly don't think most Australians, particularly my age and younger, would have any idea who she is, which is a real shame. And it would be very, very nice to see that painting of Nancy go somewhere where it can get a lot of attention and bring a lot of attention and a lot of eyes to her story, because she is a phenomenal character.
I suppose through your own experiences and bringing that into parallel with what George does, how do you articulate the messages and the stories behind what these people have done, but I suppose also bring to light some creative input and I suppose try to take it off the page and make the experience for people like you tonight so amazing?
For me, I'm a writer. I tell my stories through the words. I have no ability to go beyond that. Somebody like George Petru can look at the stories that people like me write, and he gets into them and he understands them, and he has an ability to draw that story out through the visual arts, and that's something that I can't even possibly, and I cannot get my mind around how he does that. But he has an ability to tell the entire story. He can literally take the ink from the page and put it into paint on the canvas, and that's a rare talent.
Last question from me. Just the event itself, I suppose there's no perfect way to be able to display the artwork, have a presentation like this, but how did you find the format? How have you seen people interact with the space?
I've been to 3 or 4 of these shows with Findex. I think they've pretty much got it spot on, the way that these events run, in that they're very personal. You can get up close to George and the people that he has speaking. He has Ross Coulthard here tonight, who is just a wonderful, respectable journalist. And they have an ability to put these functions together at a very, very high quality, very, very beautiful functions with impressive people and speakers, and yet make it somehow feel local, grassroots, and everybody is very approachable. And you can see that tonight, the way people are just mingling around, looking at the art, talking to George. It's a very, very comfortable atmosphere that Findex have created, and they do a very good job.
Thanks for having me, Simon.
My pleasure, thank you.
Hello, I just thought I would give you context to the next video you're about to see. It's a story I heard about 6 months ago, and I just thought this story had to be told. It is the story of Norman Morris, who was a prisoner at Sandakan during the Second World War. Sandakan was in Borneo and it was one of the most brutal Japanese camps. Norman and 4 of his mates escaped. They were on the run for 6 months. Then they were finally captured and sent back to Sandakan. Luckily for them, the war ended and they lived to tell the tale. Coincidentally, I'd actually met Norman's son over 10 years ago. He was a neighbour of mine. So I contacted him and sort of asked him about the story. And once we started chatting, I said to him, would you be okay if I painted your dad and gifted it to you and your family as a thank you for your dad's service? And he was delighted with that. So I said, we will be doing a tour on the Gold Coast, and his son lives on the Gold Coast. So I said, would you be happy to have it presented to you then? And he said, that would be wonderful. He also told me that he had written a song about his dad, and the song's called Sandakan, and asked whether it would be appropriate if he performed it. And I said, that would be wonderful. If you would like to do that, we'd be more than thrilled. So just prior to him going on stage, I'd mentioned to him, I said, how many times have you sung this song? And he goes, I've only sung it 3 times in public, so this will be the 4th time. So he had performed this song to the audience, and it was personally very emotional for me, and it was just a breathtaking performance, and everyone in the audience was so thrilled and totally surprised because no one knew that he was going to be there. Oh, by the way, I did mention who Norman's son is. He's Russell Morris, the real thing. And let me just say, Russell was one of the nicest guys you'd ever want to meet. So I just want to say thank you, Russell. It was a magnificent performance. All the best. Thank you. Bye.
Tell you a story, it's been around a while, into the heart of the darkness, Borneo wild, by Memo Run.
Sandakan was a song, it's a very special song to me, and I wanted to do it as almost a salute to Robert Johnson, who I really love, so I wanted to get the old time feel on it, and I had a beautiful guitar player play it with me, was Phil Manning, who I've always, strangely enough, Phil has played on all my very early records, and now it's the full circle is turned. But this is a special song because it's about my father who escaped from the Sandakan March, the forced march. The 2,600 Allied soldiers, only 100 survived, and he escaped and was on the run for 6 months. And interesting story.
But now you know the story, so you can actually hear some of it. Tell you a story that's been around a while, the heart of the darkness, Borneo wide. 5 men will run, 5 men will stay. From the rising sun, they would all get away. 6 months around, every night, every day. And Louis Suarez and Winty Will and Willie got away into the jungle. From the Sandakan they did run and hide, living on things that creep and crawl, only moving late at night. Ghosts in the jungle, shadows in time. Ghosts in the jungle, ones left behind. After a while, they met up with the underground for the gold gun supplies with a promissory note and pounds, signing the names of Shirley Temple, Robert Menzies, Churchill and Kine. From a man called Texan, they all waved him goodbye. They taxing every dime. Ghost in the jungle, shadows in time. Ghost in the jungle,